It's April 25, Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum starts its operation. My name is Svetlana Cherednychenko, and now we will be talking about protection of the cultural heritage sites from Russian threats and destruction and appropriation, and how can we bring the stolen objects back. Let me introduce our guests. They're Daryna Pidhorna, a lawyer with the Regional Center for Human Rights. Joining us online is Nataliia, Hendel, an expert of the Foundation for Support of the Fundamental Research, a researcher at the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. Tymur, Korotkyi, head of the Foundation for Support of Fundamental Research. And joining us in our studio are Anastasiia Cherednychenko, chair of the International Council of Museums of Ukraine, and Mariana, Tomyn, director of the Cultural Heritage Department of the Ministry of Culture and Information Policy. So we all understand that Russia, our enemy, they wage war against different aspects of our life, against our people, against our cultural heritage sites, either destroying them or stealing them and deporting to their territory. So, Miss Mariana, first question to you. What is the number of destroyed and appropriated cultural heritage sites? At least the number that is aware to us, and how do we keep track of all those damages inflicted by the Russians on our cultural heritage facilities? So more than a million of cultural heritage objects of the Museum Foundation of Ukraine, which is the property of the people of Ukraine, were damaged or destroyed by Russians. Well, I thought I would be given the floor to summarize, so I was going to talk about the solutions, and it's important for me to have such to be invited for the presentation of such an important analytical survey, and those data are important for the state because currently the institutional capacities require permanent consultations with the experts, civil society, and based on that we may state about some clear solutions that can be implemented by the state, because without surveys, without analytics, such solutions are impossible to implement. There was an agency working in Ukraine on search and return of the cultural values, and I think this issue is very important now because all of the issues of scientific research, cost of those objects, their value, and the return of them to Ukraine, all of those issues should be implemented on the level of the full-fledged functioning institutions whose activity and operation will be supported by the legislation on return of the cultural values. And I think that all of those capacities, if we talk seriously about what we need to bring back in what way and how the aggressor state should pay for that, we have to focus on all possible platforms that crimes against cultural heritage are the evidences of the crime of genocide of Ukrainian people. Ms. Daryna, those crimes committed by Russian Federation currently in Ukraine, for us, for our state, they are new, well, within the last 10 years. So is our legislation ready? Is it perfect enough for proper assessment of the damages inflicted by Russian Federations on our cultural heritage, or do we need to take some amendments that should be implemented just immediately? I'm talking specifically about the mobile cultural heritage objects. Good afternoon. Thank you for giving the floor. Well, our legislation is just not as perfect as we would like it to see. Unfortunately, it's a little bit obsolete. We've inherited it from the Soviet era. It's not adapted to the current realities, and it's a huge challenge not only for the politicians who in fact are implementing the cultural policies, the representatives of the museum sector or other cultural institutions, but it's a challenge for law enforcement agencies too, who are facing this massive number of crimes committed by Russian Federation against the cultural heritage objects and representatives of cultural institutions, because currently the national legislation does not contemplate the sufficient number of standards of criminal law or other provisions of criminal law that would allow protecting the cultural heritage of those who deal with it, and it creates a lot of obstacles. In the year 2020, Ukraine ratified two important documents. Ukraine has signed those documents: Second Protocol to the Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Values during the Armed Conflicts, and Nicosia Convention on Criminal Activities against the cultural values. That's the framework convention of the Council of Europe. So those two documents are quite an important legal instrument that allows our law enforcement and our, so to say, cultural sector representatives to use those instruments against Russian Federation, to hold them accountable at the level of the national legislation. And for the time being, we have many cases on the level, for example, of the prosecutor's office of the Republic of Crimea in violation of Article 438, on par with application of the provisions of those two conventions. But when we come to the issues of repatriation and restitution and other instruments that allow us to bring back what we've lost, they are not enough. And currently, even on the level of national legislation, such provisions are non-existent in Ukraine that would allow us to at least formally use them. Unfortunately, we have a tool created by the Ministry of Information Policy and Culture that allows us assessing the damage inflicted on the cultural heritage objects, but it's only the assessment of the losses. It says nothing about restitution that comes after the assessment. And currently in international practice, there is a number of international agreements that Ukraine should have sign, ratify, and harmonize with the national legislation. I'm specifically talking about the Convention of UNIDROIT dated 1995 on illegally transported and appropriated cultural values that should be that is critically important to be signed and harmonized with the national legislation, because it's the only international agreement available to be signed by Ukraine that would avail us to initiate cases against Ukraine to start the talks about the possibility of having the cultural values brought back, those that we lost. And it's not only about the facilities like the archives, museums, and other facilities, but also the objects that were staying inside. And the same would relate to the archaeological excavations that are illegally taking place in Crimea. Russia is digging them up, selling, transporting, just like Ivazovsky's picture, the Moonlight, that was recently sold in Moscow at an auction. So all those tools would help us a lot, but unfortunately it's still an open question, and we only hope that this government will have the political will to sign those international documents to start this dialogue. And we hope that this report, this survey, this is what we say in our survey that we've prepared on the level of coalition, that it will all assist the state to resort to such movements in the direction of the lost values. So what is the experience of Ukraine in terms of return of the lost values? The first thing that comes up to my mind is the Scythian gold. So it's about the return, but talking about reimbursement, restitution, do we have any practice in this area? Well, the restitution doesn't only envisage the material reimbursement, so we think that it should be paid back with money, but it can be restitution, actually the return of what was stolen, like a Scythian gold that after 10 years of the court proceedings in Court of Amsterdam, we've taken away the Scythian gold back home after those 10 years without any violations. And then if the violator is publicly recognized in court as a guilty party, then the values are being returned. So even if that opposite party will protect, the object would still be returned to Ukraine. Also, we have a practice of return of the antique swords and other artifacts from America. It was back in the year, I think, 23, if I'm not mistaken, when during some transportation of stolen Ukrainian cultural values, the Americans have identified it and solemnly handed it over to Sophia of Kiev. Also, there was a case with one of the Baltic countries when I think we had some values returned from Estonia that were transported there. The gold was transported there by the black archaeologists from Russia. It was actually stolen from Crimea. So we have practical cases, and they are the demonstration of the fact that we can do it and we should do it, and not in single cases, but we should to scale it up. We have to scale up our dialogue, and we are poised to make it because we have at least 3 successful cases that were won in favor of Ukraine. Thank you very much, Ms. Daryna. So I would like to continue the conversation about the international work on reimbursement and return of the values. I'm asking the technical team to put Ms. Nataliia on the screen. Ms. Nataliia, it's a pleasure to have you here in Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum. Good afternoon, Ms. Nataliia. Talking about the international cooperation with regard to this topic, what is the legal background for the negotiations about the return of cultural values? Thank you for your question. Well, first of all, Ms. Daryna has already mentioned the UNIDROIT Convention dated 1995. Again, it may serve as a legal background for negotiation between the countries on return of cultural values and restitution. And also, this legal background includes the UNESCO Convention 1970 on activities aiming at prevention and prohibition of illegal transportation and handover of titles to cultural values. And I have to say that generally the negotiations are a peaceful way to solve the international disputes with regard to return and restitution of cultural values. Such negotiations may be going on with the violating country. We're talking about Russian Federation here, but we understand that such negotiations can only take place after the end of hostilities. Also, such negotiations may be going on with mediation of international government organizations and agencies like UNESCO, first of all, and the mediator in international negotiations can also be a non-government institutions. There are many factors that influence the success of such negotiations. First of all, we're talking about the political will of the states to return the cultural values. Another important factor that influences the success of this process is the legal factor, the legal background of the claims. With regard to those cultural values, I have to add that the institutional mechanisms for the negotiations for the return of cultural values, I'm talking about international intergovernmental committee that functions within the framework of UNESCO, which supports the return of illegally appropriated cultural values to have them brought back to the state where they belong, the country of origin of those cultural values. And UNESCO is quite an active mediator in intergovernment negotiations on return of cultural values. Such cases are existing with regard to return of cultural values to Cambodia, Afghanistan. Yet another mechanism, another tool that the state may use for the return of cultural values in terms of negotiations, in terms of international cooperation, is the platform such as General Assembly of United Nations Organization, because the General Assembly of the United Nations may adopt resolutions calling for the governments of some countries to return cultural certain cultural values. Such resolutions were already adopted by the General Assembly, for example, in the situation between Iraq and Kuwait. So there is a lot of international legal opportunities to return the cultural values, including the mediation, including the direct negotiations. But we have to understand that those countries maybe ended up in the territories of the third countries. Ms. Daryna has already mentioned such successful cases. And to return such cultural values, we need to use some influence of negotiations process. We need to have some political will. For example, the United States had the political will to return the cultural values to Ukraine, and also participation in international agreements that protect the cultural values and support their return to the country of origin. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Nataliia, for your comment. I'm asking our technical team to put Mr. Tymur on the screen. Good afternoon, Mr. Tymur. I apologize for not seeing you so far. We would like not only hear you but see you too. So we're seeing you now. So good afternoon, Mr. Tymur. So there's a lot of talks of economic sanctions, but there are also cultural sanctions. Can you give us more color on operation of this mechanism? Is it efficient based on the international experience, and were there any cases when international organizations were interfering in certain processes, helping the governments of the countries in return of the stolen artifacts and reimbursement of damage? Thank you for your question. Let me start with some words with regard to our project. Is related to restitution and return of the cultural values, but it has become a continuation of the projects that were implemented by our organization, the Foundation for Support of Fundamental Research and the Regional Center for Human Rights. So our previous project was related to war crimes against museums and intangible cultural values, and we were documenting and providing assessment of the war crimes against museums of Ukraine. More than 50 cases, the war crimes against museums. And it's more of a matter of documenting and evaluation or assessment. We've provided more than 5 different assessments. The attacks on museums as civilian facilities or random attacks, also the attack of cultural facilities, attack on cultural values, and a number of other evaluations, as well as those related to pillaging and appropriation of the museum objects. So all of the issues related to future restitution. So our focus was on harmonization of national legislation and participation of Ukraine in international conventions related to restitution, as well as return of cultural values, and generally in conventions that protect cultural values during the wars. There was already mentions of conventions that are more related to restitution, but I would say that in the first place there are the conventions on international humanitarian law dedicated to the protection of cultural values, the Hague Convention 1954. Then there was a mention of second protocol to this convention that we've ratified relatively recently. Also, there is the first protocol to this convention, and the participants of or members of those conventions. Well, Ukraine is a member of this convention starting from the Soviet era. We were also analyzing the national legislation, institutional capacities, and we were talking already about the necessity to establish a dedicated institution that would deal directly with identification, search, and return of the cultural values, stolen as a result of armed conflict, along with the compensation of damage inflicted on cultural values. It also requires certain amendments to the legislation. We were also studying the experience of Ukraine and global experience, as well as use of international court institutions. They use or application of the national experience of the countries on establishment of dedicated units and agencies, the units in the armed forces and in the police, on search and return of cultural values. That's a very important experience. There are already such processes on the way in the armed forces, and one of our recommendations is the establishment of an agency for search of the cultural values and adoption of the dedicated legislation that would be related not in general to the return of cultural values. Such law already does exist, but specific legislation dedicated to the return of cultural values related to armed conflict. So it's a matter of sanctions in the cultural sphere, as you've asked, and I would like to refer to security agreements, because some of the security agreements that were adopted recently clearly stipulate that the government should cooperate in the area of return of cultural values. The cooperation in the area of security between Ukraine and Canada, this agreement says about cooperation in discovery of the facts of pillage by Russia of the cultural values. Also, those issues are covered in the agreement between Ukraine and the Netherlands. We've already mentioned the award by the Dutch court, and some of the provisions of this agreement are dedicated to protection of cultural values and their return to Ukraine. In my opinion, those aspects are extremely important. They can happen within the framework of international organizations such as UNESCO, and both at the level of the cultural cooperation between the countries, at the level of academia, and they also influence the return and identification and protection of cultural values during armed conflict. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Tymur. Just recently, the International Council of Museums of Ukraine has launched the new project, the identification of mobile cultural values of cultural objects of Ukraine. Why is it interesting? Ms. Nataliia, tell us please, what are the main areas of activity implemented currently by the Council? Just like previous speaker, let me start with what is International Museum Council. It's one of the biggest professional networks of a global level, and we're one of the national committees of ICOM. And Ms. Nataliia has mentioned international non-government organizations, so it's us. We are exactly the representatives of such international non-government organizations. So in Ukraine we represent ICOM. We create the network inside Ukraine. We try to implement the standards for activity of the museums, the global standards. And it's clear that after the year 22, just like in case of others, we've changed our priorities. As I've mentioned, ICOM is a non-government institution, and it has like a domino effect. UN, UNESCO, ICOM, they are all created within the framework of the post-war recovery, the re-establishment of the world order. And ICOM is involved in fulfillment the UNESCO program. Like, for example, UNESCO works on a government level, like on the level with the ministries in our case, and ICOM in this scheme is more flexible. We can work with reliable partners, but the choice is ours, one way or another. And we are both representatives of ICOM in Ukraine and representatives of Ukraine in ICOM. And as representatives of Ukraine, starting from year 22, we permanently and monotonously keep reporting our international partners, providing the letters, the references, the facts. First we answer their questions and then we tell them what's going on after they've got familiarized with those letters of ours. Well, they were feeling less convenient in terms of asking questions, but we keep reporting on what's going on with the cultural values in Ukraine, with the cultural heritage objects and facilities in Ukraine, and what is the input of the military there. International colleagues say that it's not only the Russian military but the representatives of Russian museum sector. There is the representation of ICOM there in Russia, and the members of ICOM may be both institutional, like museums, and individuals. Some representatives of Russian ICOM, they take part in committing the war crimes against Ukrainian cultural heritage. And we were told multiple times that we need facts, and then we've decided that we need to establish a task force that is capable of providing the facts that would be not so easy to reject. But talking more seriously, starting from the April 2022, there is a number of instruments available to ICOM for protection of cultural values. There is a department for heritage protection headed by Sophie Delopre, and one of such tools is the creation of blacklist of threats to cultural heritage, like such threats as war or acts of God. In our case, unfortunately, it's war. And we were approached with the initiative to create such a red list of cultural heritage that is being threatened. So there was no such initiative back in 2014. We just started in April 2022. As soon as the enemy was ousted from Kiev region, we immediately proceeded to the activities related to putting together such a red list that includes the cultural heritage objects from archaeology to visual arts. And the goal of this tool, the purpose of this tool was to draw attention of the global community to the threats posed to Ukrainian cultural heritage, and it's another instrument for the art dealers, customs personnel, international law enforcement, and representatives of museum sectors. So when an art dealer or a law enforcement person comes across certain object, they can identify it as Ukrainian cultural heritage, and they need to inspect their sources of its origin. How did this or that citizen crossing the border obtained such an archaeological artifact or a picture? And that instrument has proven its efficiency. UNESCO is creating conferences where they gather everybody who is related to the museum object, the museum sector employees, the customs employees, and we were familiarizing the representatives of all those international organizations like national law enforcement agencies or Interpol. Like you were mentioning, we need to establish an agency dedicated to the return of cultural values in many countries. In the law enforcement sector, there are such organizations involved in protection of cultural heritage, and representatives of such organizations who protect cultural values in the law enforcement agencies, they also are invited to such events. So one of the functions is to inform them of the threat and to present the cultural heritage objects that ended up under threat. So that is the task covered by this red list. And then, as we proceed to the facts, we've decided that it's important to document the crimes against theft of the mobile cultural heritage objects, and we have a number of tracks in this sector. First of all, it's documenting of the stolen objects, the monitoring of their locations, the way they were stolen, where they are now, then who is involved in the theft. And another track is the operation of Russian museums. We were doing it even before on a smaller scale. And that's yet another proof of participation of Russian museums in committing those war crimes. This project falls under the framework of the Program of Development of Civil Activities Get Involved, supported by the USAID and US Embassy. And in this project we cooperate with PR Army, Information Resistance as monitoring experts. On one hand, I understand the different projects, they have such initiatives, and I'm missing consolidation here on our end. We try to partner too. Specifically, our partner is one of such important initiatives, important and powerful, that popped up in year 24. It's EMO. The colleagues were sharing information with us when we had to submit the reports. Soon it's or these days it's a sad anniversary of detonation of Kakhovka Dam, and thanks to our partners from that initiative we were able to promptly provide the report to our international colleagues. So on our end, as a government organization, we can provide expertise, we can document, we can hand over the documents to the law enforcement agencies, but we also understand that during the return we hope we're priming the ground for the return. And the UNIDROIT Convention was mentioned here a number of times, and we expect that our colleagues from ICOM, when they were visiting Lviv, they were asking the representatives of Ministry of Culture, why don't we want to ratify this convention? I understand why France wouldn't want to ratify it, but why don't you want to do this? So basically on our end, we are ready to provide expertise. Thank you, Ms. Anastasiia. Ms. Mariana, now that we've mentioned the Ministry of Culture again, as you were waiting, as you were expecting in the beginning of conversation, so there is a number of initiatives to document this type of crimes. You were mentioning too that now there are discussions on establishment of such institution that would be directly involved in dealing with the issues of stolen cultural values. So what is the plan of the government in this sector? What are the initial steps? Is there any discussion on adoption and ratification of those conventions that were mentioned today? So what are the plans for the coming years to have all those crimes documented, if possible, hold those perpetrators accountable, and to get the reimbursement? Well, if I have a comprehensive question to answer, probably I wouldn't be sitting here, or we all wouldn't be sitting here, but there is a number of things I would like to focus on to to have things look more optimistic, we really need all of that stuff. So first of all, a matter of multiple initiatives, I think it's only a plus, because the only thing, the matter of partnership between the initiatives, it's a matter of mentality of Ukrainian people, why many things are not yet synchronized. Basically, then the matter of consolidation of efforts, again, is, in my opinion, the responsibility of the state agencies, government agencies. And it's not always that it doesn't always happen like that the expectations put in the government are satisfying the professional crowds. It's a natural thing. And for example, from year 2014 until year 22, there were no conclusions drawn from the fact that there is a war going on. And it's again a fact that we have to realize and recognize. This is why in year 22, the state was not doing things just in a way that the professionals were expecting, including the museum professionals. I clearly realize it. The solution, though, it's important to look for the solution starting from that very moment. There was an important idea expressed about the way that Russia treats those crimes that they commit, even by the museum professionals. Russia only has two directions of movement with relation to Ukrainian identity, to us as a nation, and to cultural values. So there are only two options. First, on the level of the legislation, they add the artifacts stolen from us to their museum foundations. That's an absolutely intentional government policy. Or otherwise they destroy those objects. There is no third option. If we have any illusions to achieve any agreements with them on the level of international summits, symposia, in a civilized way, if we still hope to do this, my suggestion is to stop hoping. So how should we group it? We need a full-fledged institution that will have its law enforcement segment and expert section, and this is how we can start talking about the expert solutions. Talking about the dedicated legislation, it's not only a matter of conventions. We're not talking about the law on movement of cultural values. I'm talking about the legislational foundation that describes the return. And talking about the return of the cultural values, we have to take into account the realities of war. And from the point of view of international law, we have a unique opportunity to develop the protocols that do not exist, because we only leave it all in real time. Those are very complicated international issues. Even our claims to our legislation, they are fair. But even talking about the effect of international laws in this situation, we're facing the situation when the international law just does not work in all areas, in humanitarian area and in the sector of cultural values. So we have to develop the new protocols that would be in compliance with our interests and reestablishment of justice, because people may have very different definitions of justice. Is it return, or is it reimbursement, or is it some other provisions of criminal law? So I think that during the war and after the war, we have at least 10 years of work in this area. Thank you, Ms. Mariana. Ms. Daria, as patriots, we all require justice. We all expect for justice. We expect all of the perpetrators to be held accountable. So, in your opinion, is it real to hold accountable those who commit those crimes with their own hands in the international level? Is it possible to bring them all to accountability, to liability? Good question. To summarize it, and I have to say, we don't have to rely too much upon the international law. Unfortunately, we won't be able to achieve any significant results in terms of return of the cultural values to Ukraine. The majority of cases will be solved on the level of national law of Ukraine, and I have to give our law enforcement their due, specifically the Prosecutor's Office of Crimean Republic, who starting from the year 2013 keeps opening criminal provisions with regard to those who are directly involved in destruction of cultural values in Crimea. Also, the General Prosecutor's Office, they bring this issue of the cultural values on the same level with other crimes committed during this armed conflict. It's very cool, but still we have to have all of those cases ending up in court so that the judges can come up with the awards either in favor or not in favor of Ukraine. For the time being, there are about 500 or even more than 500 cases on the level of national legislation. They are all on the stage of documenting on the level of study of situation, but they're all related to Article 431, the violation of laws and practices of war, and they are all open in 2014, 2022. The destruction as a result of application of artillery fire or mortar fire. Also, there were cases on transportation and deportation of cultural values. Talking about when we talk about the museums of Mariupol, Crimea, they all fall under this framework. We're talking about the illegal archaeological excavations that resulted in theft and deportation and maybe destruction of thousands or maybe millions of Ukrainian artifacts, the destruction of Bakhchisarai Museum that ended up in temporarily occupied territories. They are all diverse stories, but they are all being investigated on the level of national legislation. If we dream about the international legislation, in my opinion, the only institution for the time being that can theoretically help us to restore this justice with regard to cultural values, Ukrainian identity and history is International Criminal Court. In the year 20 or 21, ICC issued a policy with regard to the protection of cultural values during these two most intense crimes: genocide, aggression, crime of war, and crimes against humanity. International Criminal Court is the only institution that can hold perpetrators accountable and enforce compensation from them as a part of the application of their mechanisms. It has already happened. For example, the case of al-Bashir as to the demolition of mausoleums in Timbuktu that used to be the cultural heritage objects. And there was a case on reparation. It was a successful demonstration of the fact that international legislation is capable of such practices and they can enforce reimbursement in favor of the party affected. And what was interesting, the economic damages were calculated, and the majority of population that were living near those mausoleums, they were trading different souvenirs and paraphernalia like magnets, and it was the only way for them to maintain their subsistence. And after the mausoleums were destroyed, they had no way to feed their families, and then after the demolition, 50 million euro were enforced in their favor. After that, UNESCO rebuilt all 13 mausoleums. That's a beautiful practice. Ukraine has to study it and probably use in our story. We have a wonderful opportunity to apply to the criminal court, International Criminal Court, based on the facts on the destruction of Khersones or Mariupol drama theater that was terribly demolished and people died during the aviation strike on that theater. But to do that, we need to have political will. We have the stimuli on part of the law enforcement, because our organization has already applied based on the facts of demolition of cultural heritage in Crimea, specifically Khersones, and for the time being we want to submit another report, and we hope that the office of Karim Khan will pay attention to this report. They will pay attention to the facts, and among those whom we see as those who can be held accountable, first of all, it's Putin. He is the head of the state, and all those policies, they are based upon his instructions and orders. But also we're talking about the top level officials like the Minister of Culture of Russian Federation, Olga Lyubimova, or her predecessor, I've forgotten his last name, Medvedev, I guess, who again was issuing orders for illegal excavations, who was issuing permits for construction of historic and archaeological park in Khersones that destroyed all of the architecture of this unique UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the representatives of museum sector who are the heads of the biggest museums of Russian Federation like Hermitage, probably even the director of the Khersones Museum, who is Russian citizen, and probably we can talk about the directors of those scientific institutions such as Russian Academy of Sciences or some of its units, the Museum of Archaeology of Russian Academy of Sciences, or Museum of Cultural Heritage of Russian Federation, whose workers, whose employees, they directly take part in those crimes. They excavate, they steal, they transport, they deport, and they are still present in international cultural markets. They can attend the meetings of UNESCO in Paris and the meetings of other non-government organizations. They are still present in scientific museums of countries of Europe, America, Asia, Africa. They can be found everywhere, and that's an absolute paradox. When we talk about the crimes, we're saying that they are supposed to be punished, they should be held accountable. At the same time, the global community admits those perpetrators, those criminals, to international arena without any hesitation. It's a paradox for me and probably for someone else, and we have to continue bringing up this issue through the policy of sanctions with regard to those specific individuals and their institutions. And we're talking about the criminal law, national law, and international law that allows us doing so. Thank you very much, Ms. Daryna. Dear journalists, do you have any questions on the floor? Tatiana Pasova, Ukrinform. I'm having two questions. First is for Ms. Daryna. Today many speakers were saying about the changes, the international documents that are supposed to be ratified for more efficient return of the cultural values. Can you please summarize what are the most fundamental international agreements we have to ratify, and what are the changes that we need to make to the national legislation for more efficient work in this area? And another question to those participants of the conference who have any information about this: is there a list of persons involved in pillaging, theft, and deportation of Ukrainian cultural values? Thank you. Let me start. And let me start with what is the easiest to do today. If we talk about the international law and unification of it with the national law, I've mentioned two documents, two agreements. First is the second protocol to the Hague Convention on dated 1954, and Nicosia Convention dated year 1920. We've signed it, we've ratified it, but those documents are not are not harmonized with the national law. So the terminology used in that legislation is not in line with the one used in the national law. For example, the convention, like the first article on the convention dated 1954 on protection of cultural values, it says about such term as cultural values, and they only include the mobile cultural value, or like real estate value and mobile value, like museums, museum houses, cultural objects, museum objects. But at the same time, in Ukrainian legislation, there is a term cultural legislation, cultural heritage, that repeats the essence of that article, but sometimes also they include some non-material cultural heritage. And it's a problem because when we come to the criminal proceedings, the prosecutors get lost. They don't know which legislation should they use. Convention says one thing, national legislation says another thing. How could they be all explained to the judges, to the lawyers, to other prosecutors, and they all get lost. They don't know how to explain the cultural value. And talking about the Diderot Convention on prohibition and prevention of theft and transportation of cultural values, again, it can be signed and adopted and harmonized with the Ukrainian legislation. And another convention mentioned by Ms. Hendel, the UNESCO Convention dated 1970, it's a very important document for us that we need to sign and harmonize with the national law to make sure that we can bring our cultural values back, at least on the level of bilateral agreements with other countries, non-Russian Federation, of course, because it's clear that Russian Federation does not comply with any of its obligations, and hardly they would even ever agree to do so. And in response to your second question about the list of persons, for what I know, currently there is no such a consolidated list of the perpetrators representing the cultural sector, but on the level of legislation of the Central Prosecutor's Office and the Security Service and the Prosecutor's Office of Crimea, they have the names of those people. I don't know whether they are public lists. I don't know whether on this phase of investigation they should be made publicly available. However, it's no secret those people can be found in media and other open sources. They are archaeologists, scientists, representatives of, say, museum sector and Russian politics, but I don't remember about the existence of such consolidated list. Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions on the floor? If we do not, I would like to thank our guests. Let me remind you, we were talking about the way we can protect the cultural heritage of Ukraine against theft and deportation by the Russians. We will be back in studio in just half an hour. We will be talking about the fighting enemy on the sea and ensuring the safe operation of the grain corridor. Stay tuned.